Not everything we build is designed to last forever. Most creations have a purpose, and when that purpose has been served, the creation is no longer required. In this busy modern world, we often destroy old and unwanted buildings to make room for new ones, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes those old places and spaces just get left behind and abandoned, waiting for someone to come and find them. When we do find them, they provide us with a window into the past. Here in this video, you're about to see some of the most incredible abandoned places in the world. Our first stop on this tour of abandonment is the Lost Gardens of Heligan, but they're not really lost. We know exactly where to find them. They're close to the town of Mevagissey in Cornwall, England. The gardens belong to the Heligan estate, which has been the property of the Tremaine family since the mid-18th century. The strange structures and sculptures found in the garden also date back to that time, but fell into abandonment after the First World War broke out. It wasn't until 80 years later that people came back to the gardens in an attempt to restore them, and found that Europe's only remaining pineapple pit was still at the site, and still worked. Powered by decomposing manure, the pit makes it possible to grow tropical fruit in the cold British climate. In among all the exotic plants are two sculptures that have come to define the gardens, the so-called Mud Maid and also the Giant's Head. The garden's lakes are fed by an antiquated ram pump that's more than a century old. All over the world, the name Bugatti is associated with wealth and luxury. But there's nothing luxurious about this crumbling old factory that once belonged to the company. The EB110 GT, the fastest car of its era, was manufactured inside these walls. But the plant was closed during the mid-1990s and has been decaying ever since. It's been more than 20 years since workers turned up to the factory to go about their daily duties, and yet relics of the past can still be found here. Much of the car building equipment is still on site, albeit coated with rust, and there are even office keys and technical manuals left on desks, as if someone intended to come back for them one day. Telephones are still plugged in, and magazines are still strewn around for the non-existent workers to flick through during lunch hours that are never going to come. Bugatti decided that the factory was obsolete, and so they moved to a more modern workplace. But based on this pictorial evidence, it would seem that they neglected to clean up after themselves before they left. The houses of Admirals Row in Brooklyn, New York, once served a noble purpose. There are 10 of them in total, and they were used to house naval officers in the city. Constructed between 1864 and 1901, the homes were there to provide shelter to officers who served at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. By the mid-1960s, the Navy Yard had become surplus to requirements and was closed down, but some of the officers stayed in the homes for a decade beyond that. By the mid-1970s, though, even those holdouts had moved on, and the houses began to fall into disrepair. Trees and plants grew not only around them, but also straight through them, leading to partial wall and roof collapses by the end of the 20th century. Pictures of the derelict houses began to circulate on the internet in 2012, which seemed to shame the National Guard into taking action to do something about the eyesores. Demolition and redevelopment work at the site began in 2016, but even now, there's still one old home and an even older timber shed still standing. If you don't know anything about the site of Garage Number 7 in Kyiv, it's a building that lends itself well to the imagination. What could it possibly be? The vast disc-shaped building looks a little like the classic depiction of a flying saucer. Is it a fallen spaceship? Of course not. So perhaps it might be an old, disused cathedral. It's actually nothing of the sort. Despite its grand appearance, this is nothing more than an old bus shelter. The shelter opened in 1973 and served more than 400 buses every day, a gargantuan task that necessitated the employment of more than 1,400 people. A Russian architect known as Zinkevich was commissioned to design the building, which locals still refer to as the circus. Nothing even vaguely similar to this was ever built to house buses anywhere else in the USSR. Looking at these pictures, you would assume that it's been abandoned for many years, but it was actually still in use until 2015. There's even a fleet of buses still parked up at the site, although looking at the state of them, it's doubtful they'll ever move again. As an island nation, Great Britain couldn't afford to take chances with any of its coastlines during the Second World War. An invasion attempt could come from anywhere, and so the whole coast needed armaments and protection. That's how extensive sea and submarine defenses came to be built on Cram and Island in Scotland, a strip of land only 2,000 feet long. The island is close to the River Almond and had a submarine defense wall and gun placements added to ensure no unwanted visitors attempted to sail up the river. Originally, there were also barracks, but they've completely collapsed in the years since the war ended. Visit the island today, and you'll still find the wall, along with ammunition stores, shelters, and the engine room that provided power for all the military equipment. Graffiti artists have left their mark on the old buildings, but they're often the only visitors the once busy military site receives. The fact that the wall is still standing after so many years without maintenance is a testament to its robust design. Staying with the theme of abandoned Second World War military installations for a moment, you'll find Battery Oldenburg on the outskirts of Calais, where it once formed part of the German Army's Atlantic Wall. The first pieces of military hardware placed at the site were 2 artillery guns in 1940, but casemates were later built around the guns, turning the site into a small fort. Interestingly, the weapons that were used here were 240mm guns that the Germans captured from the Russian side. What you can see at ground level is only the tip of the iceberg. The western casemate is 2 levels deep, and its eastern neighbor has a 3rd story below the surface. You'll also find a hospital and fire control bunker at the site that still has frescoes and paintings on the walls. The Kriegsmarine commanded the site from 1941 until 1944, when it came under heavy fire and ultimately surrendered to advancing Canadian forces. Apparently, during its years of operation, local civilians thought it was too pretty to be a military structure and used to jokingly refer to it as Les Moulins Rouges. With an appearance that reminds a lot of people of a vast ship marooned on the land, the Hotel Belvedere du Ray Aver was a triumph of Art Deco design when it was built in Cerbère, France in 1932. Of all the buildings that were designed by the famed French architect Léon Bayle, it's said that this was his pride and joy. Fortunately, he didn't live long enough to see what eventually became of it. During its peak years, the hotel was the pinnacle of luxury, with grand ballrooms, movie theaters, high-end restaurants, and even a full-sized tennis court on its roof. Now it's a concrete skeleton, becoming more decrepit and derelict with each passing year. The hotel was abandoned in 1983 during the Spanish Civil War and never reopened. It would probably have been demolished already, but the French Ministry of Culture designated it as a protected historic monument in 1987, which means it can't be closed down. Given that they've ensured that it can't be torn down, they could at least attempt to restore it instead of leaving it like this. What's a Cold War-era Soviet submarine doing on the River Medway in the southeast of England? It's not an invasion. It's actually supposed to be a floating museum, although it would appear that someone abandoned it part of the way through the refurbishment process. Known as the Black Widow, the submarine belonged to the Soviet Project 641 class and was commissioned in 1967. It spent the bulk of its military service with the Soviet Baltic Fleet, and then became a training vessel as it became a little older, before finally being decommissioned in 1994. A British collector bought it and opened it to the public as a museum ship close to the Thames Barrier in London. But in 1998 it changed hands again and moved to Folkestone, continuing its museum duties. A third British collector bought it in 2004 and moved it to the Medway with the intention of refurbishing it and using it as a museum once more. But the project has stalled, and the submarine is now in a state of disrepair. It's not too late to save it, but doing so would presumably involve yet another new owner and a lot of money. The Sarajevo bobsleigh track is a reminder of happier and more prosperous times in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was built for the Winter Olympic Games in 1984, which were a celebration of national pride. For its time, it was once the most advanced and exciting bobsleigh tracks on the planet, with a length of 4,000 feet and containing 13 turns. For 6 years after the Olympics ended, the track remained in use, hosting world and national championships. But then war came in 1991, and the concrete tracks were reimagined as defensive positions for soldiers and their weapons. Today, the whole track bears the scars of the conflict, with bullet holes clearly visible all over both sides of the construction. The conflict is over now, but the damage done to the track means that it's beyond the point of being salvageable. Like so many forgotten concrete constructions, it's little more than a canvas for local graffiti artists. A map of the site is still standing at the entrance, which gives you an idea of what a grand spectacle it was when it was clean and new. The Theammy S Barrett is a towboat that has a proud entertainment history and would probably still be hosting entertainment today if a natural disaster hadn't spoiled all the fun. The boat was built in 1921 in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and was designated as the flagship of the Barrett Towboat and Barge Line Company. After 16 years of barge work, it became the property of the Army Corps of Engineers of Alabama in 1937. They, in turn, sold it into private ownership in 1949, when it was moved to West Alton in Missouri and became a floating clubhouse. By 1981, it was in Kentucky, where the aging vessel was refurbished and redesigned as a restaurant. By 1987, the boat was considered important enough to be listed on America's National Register of Historic Places and was taken to Vicksburg in Mississippi to become a showboat, complete with restaurant and theater. It even applied for a casino license in 1990, but then the Great Flood of 1993 came. The storm carried the boat to Concordia Parish in Louisiana, where it became beached. It's never moved since, and is now little more than a rusty shell. If the rusty walls of the Bethlehem Steelworks of Pennsylvania could talk, they would have quite a story to tell. Built in 1873, it was here that the steel used to build the Golden Gate Bridge and the Empire State Building was created. This was the beating heart of steel production in the United States of America. Perhaps even more importantly, over a third of the steel that was used to build American military armaments during the world wars of the 20th century was also made here. The best year in the history of the steelworks was 1957, during which it reached an output of 19 million tons of steel and recorded record sales figures of $2.5 billion. Sadly, the peak was also the beginning of the end. Production had halved by the 1970s and halved again during the 1980s. The market was flooded with foreign steel, and the company had made a badly judged decision to try to move into real estate, which cost it more money than it could afford to lose. By 2001, it was forced to bow to the inevitable and declared bankruptcy. Now the giant pipes and towers stand silently. A lot of money was wasted on military projects that went nowhere during the Cold War, but the so-called Pyramid of North Dakota was one of the worst offenders. Better known as the Stanley R. Mickelson Safeguard Complex, this white elephant cost the USA $6 billion and never performed any useful duties whatsoever. President Richard Nixon gave approval for the construction of the facility in 1969, believing that it would serve as an essential line of defense for the Grand Forks Air Force Base nearby. It was thought that the base would be a primary Soviet target if war broke out. By October 1975, the base was finally ready to open its doors, but Congress ordered it to be shut down within 3 days of it doing so. Among many other problems, the base was so badly designed that the nuclear warheads of the missiles it intended to use for defense distorted the on-site radar systems, meaning that the site was effectively blind. The problems couldn't be overcome, and the base has been locked down and abandoned for 45 years. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.